When I was young, the Soviet Union was about to overwhelm the United States. Now I hear China's about to overwhelm the United States. Or the United States is going to go to Vietnam and teach them a lesson or two. We live as Americans manic depressive lives, particularly when it comes to politics. It is either all lost or an easy slam dunk. Geopolitics is neither. It is a complex process of protecting your interests, understanding what your interests are, taking your enemies seriously, but not so seriously that you're paralyzed. Russia and China. Not really enemies, but sort of enemies. It has been brooded about that these two countries will get together, and as a result, we'll all be speaking Russian and Chinese in San Francisco. Firstly, geographic distance. It's a long way from Russia's wars in Ukraine and China's battles in the Pacific. It is very hard to imagine how they work together. Where do they collaborate? Where does it come together? Second, they have a really bad history with each other. You'll remember the Battle of the Ussuri River. It was a time when the Russians and the Chinese slugged it out for an extended period of time with a lot of casualties. It opened the door for Henry Kissinger to show up in Beijing and said, why don't we dance? And dance we did. And the alliance that opened up was not between Russia and China, communist countries, but temporarily with China and the United States. The United States had listening posts out in Xinjiang, listening to the Russians. I'm not sure we trusted anything that came in on it, but it was fun being out there. But China entered not into an alliance with Russia, but with the United States. Why? Because there is a deep distrust by these two countries of each other. All through the 20th century, they fought wars. Russia constantly invaded China, usually at the worst possible time. And they didn't really like each other. So when we talk about an alliance, we have to first think about geography. An alliance is not a piece of paper. It is a working military organization, like the US and Britain in World War II. There was military forces working together to achieve an end. The Russians and the Chinese do not have the ability to form such a united front. There's historical tension. They don't really trust each other. Well, I didn't really trust the Brits, but what the hell, they're ours. The idea of an alliance between the two countries has to have a geographical logic, and it has to have some sort of trust. Without that, it is simply the New York Times writing editorials. So let's talk about each of these countries a bit. Okay, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Russia lives and dies by strategic depth. It survived Napoleon because an attack into Russia starts in the summer, I should say. That's when you get your troops mobilized. And then you move toward Moscow. And by the time you get to Moscow, you freeze. Exactly the same thing happened to Hitler. He launched in June. By the time he got to Moscow, having seemingly conquered the country, he was defeated by the weather. For Russia, this is the foundation of everything. In the same way that the foundation of national security for the United States is controlling the two oceans, naval power. This is their fundamental. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was independent. The distance between the northern border of Ukraine and Moscow was 260 miles by road tree. If we take the side road, it's a little longer. The point is that Russia faced, from the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union, a catastrophic situation. Now, you and I know that the Americans can always be trusted, but the Russians have a somewhat different view. And it was desperate that they move the border west. Now, they couldn't do it fast. They didn't build a military fast enough. They needed a lot more chaos going on, and they waited for this moment. And they struck. Now, why did the United States have to get involved? Because if Ukraine fell, the Russians would be once again on the border of NATO. In other words, the United States could not give the Russians what they needed, and the Russians could not give the Americans what they needed, and so that's when wars begin. It does not begin because Putin is salivating crazily. It certainly doesn't begin because Biden is stupid. He may be, but that's not why the war begins. We can make all these claims about politicians leading us into war, but it was hardwired. It was hardwired that Russia at some point had to go into Ukraine. It was hardwired that the United States would have to resist. The Russian strategy was to send forces in. The American strategy was to have native forces, as we used to call it, Ukrainians, armed to the teeth with American weapons. We stand back, take no bodies coming in at Dover Air Force Base, thank God. Ukrainians fight for their country, and we make sure they don't lose. The critical strategy of the United States is not winning. It's preventing a loss. Because if there is preventing a loss at a certain point, the Russians will raise questions about their leadership. Also, they'll raise questions about being drafted. They started out with a small military because of a massive intelligence failure on their part. First, they completely miscalculated the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians really hate the Russians. Somebody in FSB missed that. Two, they miscalculated the Germans. They thought the Germans would stick with them because they needed oil, but a trip was brought to the United States by the chancellor, and he said, oh, I forgot, I am for the United States, excuse me, yes. And thirdly, he completely misunderstood. FSB completely misunderstood the United States. It saw that we were bad-mouthing each other, that we were enraged at everything, that we believed in the deep state and everything else. They didn't remember what the old KGB knew. This is the way we always are. We're always pissed off at somebody else. He genuinely thought this was the moment because of what he thought was instability in the United States, not just healthy exercise. And as a result, he attacked from a stupid formation. 3 armored columns, hundreds of miles apart, rushing down to envelop something that isn't there. There is no center of gravity to the Ukrainian army. Plus, those of you who ever were in Germany and ever had the pleasure of watching a Russian exercise, logistics is their biggest problem. They cannot manage moving forward at a rapid pace and keeping the fuel going too. And that's what happened to them, aside from some anti-tank missiles that work pretty well. We are now in a war which does not in any way involve China. In fact, the Chinese abstained when the UN voted on condemning Russia. Now that's a big deal because your allies are forever, like a marriage, you don't abstain. You go vote right. They didn't. This was your basic screw you to Russia, if there needed to be one. So now Russia is sitting there. What do you do in this situation? You declare that you're insane because ever you get into a bar fight, pretend to be insane. Okay? And he's been to bar fights, and he is. I'm going to nuke you. I'm going to use dirty nukes in you. I'm going to nuke your mother. I'm everybody that I can nuke. He's not an idiot. He knows that he's going to turn into radioactive dust personally if he does this. He knows that's not an option. Why does he do it? He's doing it because his back's against the wall and he's got to do something. Be calm, which is not what we're good at. But Russia had a major intelligence failure
inappropriate weapons, and didn't send enough force. His final problem is that he's had to dragoon, I won't call, not subscription, dragoon an army. He's out of an army. The one problem that he has is training an army. It's one thing having them in your camp. How do you train the infantrymen? I think we take about 6 months before someone goes through AIT. The Russians are going to send completely untrained troops into combat. Well, no, they're not. But they've done this because they had to. The basic weakness of the Russian army is a lack of sergeants. What I mean by this is the Chinese have sergeants. The British, God knows, have sergeants. Scary. The Americans, we have trainers. We have experienced forces who have been in combat, hopefully. But even if they haven't, they understand the basic principles of tactical warfare. And for 3 months, it's pounded into their heads till they never want to think of that day again. The Russians do not have sergeants. They have lieutenants who have been in 6 months, who are assigned to train people who have been there no months. This is why the Russian army performs badly. It has never had a coherent training program. Why? Because in World War II, they didn't have the time for it. And because they didn't have the time for it, they sent them in to die. And it was not kidding. The best they could do to hold the Germans, I should say, was hit them again, and take the casualties. But this is a nuanced war, a complex war, choreographed by the Americans. I won't say that the Pentagon has a lot to do with the planning, but what the hell. This is planned for it. It's with a force that's highly motivated, totally committed, and knows that it has the United States at its back, and the British at its back. Even the Germans at its back, but you don't trust. This is the problem of the Germans. It's not clear how the Russians can win. Russia has to have a peace treaty because its option is nuclear war or a peace settlement. It cannot win. Its forces are not in a position to win. They can take them in, they can spend all winter training them, and that may have some effect, but basically they have an untrained force fighting a highly motivated force backed up by the superb technologies that are available today. This is the Russian situation. The Russians have a ground problem. It's a battle problem of the infantry. The Chinese problem is a naval problem.